Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Tonight on All In, the unfolding battle to protect your right to vote in this country. It's being waged on multiple fronts in multiple states, and we've got full coverage of a whole host of developments in a moment with Texas Representative Joaquin Castro and the Reverend Al Sharpton. Also tonight, as the outrage over Russia's anti-gay laws continues to grow, we're beginning to get a disturbing picture of what life is like there for its LGBT citizens. My guest tonight is Russian, openly gay, and about to flee the country. Plus, stop and frisk and Edward Snowden, what do they have in common? A whole lot more than you might think. That is coming up, but we begin on the front lines of voter suppression, with multiple developments across the country, not the least of which is the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, suing the state of Texas. 2 states suing the federal government back, and a prominent Republican lambasting the Republican governor of North Carolina over that state's brand new voting requirements. Today, the Justice Department announced plans to file a new lawsuit against the state of Texas over its voter ID law and to intervene as a party in another case involving Texas redistricting. Attorney General Holder said, "We will not allow the Supreme Court's recent decision to be interpreted as open season for states to pursue measures that suppress voting rights. We will keep fighting aggressively to prevent voter disenfranchisement. We are determined to use all available authorities, including remaining sections of the Voting Rights Act. This represents the department's latest action to protect voting rights, but it will not be our last." A federal court in Washington had previously held that Texas failed to meet its burden of proving its redistricting plans and its voter ID law were not discriminatory. But that was set aside when the Supreme Court gutted a key section of the Voting Rights Act, leaving Texas Governor Rick Perry at liberty to implement the strict photo ID law. With today's action, Attorney General Holder is fighting back under another section of the Voting Rights Act, which still stands. Meanwhile, the states of Arizona and Kansas are suing the federal government to allow those states to go ahead with their plans to demand proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. They've been stopped from doing so by another Supreme Court ruling, though in that same ruling, the court did say that states could sue the federal government over the issue, which is what they announced they're doing today. Georgia and Alabama are also affected by that same Supreme Court ruling. So today alone, voting rights in 5 states are in direct play because of various lawsuits. And that's not all. Today brought an absolutely remarkable moment in a state that has become the front line of the voting rights battle, North Carolina, which has passed the most restrictive voter laws since the recent Supreme Court decision. Governor Pat McCrory signed the restrictive voting measures into law, and it's important to recall he defended it against left-wing extremism.
Let me be direct. Many of those from the extreme left who have been criticizing photo ID are using scare tactics. They're more interested in divisive politics than ensuring that no one's vote is disenfranchised by a fraudulent ballot.
This morning at a CEO forum in Raleigh, just seconds after Governor McCrory had left the stage, a well-known left-wing extremist, former Secretary of State retired General Colin Powell, took the stage as keynote speaker and basically let Governor McCrory have it. No audio was allowed, alas, but here's what he said. "I want to see policies that encourage every American to vote, not make it more difficult to vote. It immediately turns off a voting bloc the Republican Party needs. These kinds of actions do not build the base. It just turns people away. You can say what you like, but there is no voter fraud. How can it be widespread and undetected? What it really says to the minority voters is, we really are sort of punishing you." Joining me now, the host of Politics Nation, my colleague, the Reverend Al Sharpton. A special 2-hour edition of his show will air tomorrow, March on Washington. The dream continues. And Rev, I got to ask you your reaction to the Colin Powell comments, which I just could not believe he did that with the governor right there.
I thought it was a very courageous thing to do for him because of giving his audience, and the right thing to do. And I think that Colin Powell has shown the kind of leadership in this area we need. We're talking about, Chris, the right to vote. We're talking about people fabricating that there's some pattern of fraud that has to be dealt with here when there is no pattern of fraud. When we've done the study, the Justice Department has even done studies, it's like 0.003% fraud. So clearly this is set up, as Colin Powell said, trying to deal with minority voters not being able to vote This is the same battle, just done with a little more nuance and polish that we had to fight to get the right to vote for blacks and minorities in the first place. And this is outrageous. 50 years after the March on Washington, we have to deal with this issue, but deal with it we will.
What's striking to me is that Colin Powell said what he did. He said it in the context he said it in, but also how few figures there are in the Republican Party like Colin Powell who have said the same thing or are in the position to say the same thing. And that, to me, is precisely the problem.
I think that they're in the position, they choose to hide behind their position rather than use their positions to lead. It is, in my opinion, it is totally breathtaking that you don't have responsible leaders in the Republican Party that have said what Powell said today before now and should have come out today and said it. Because, again, we are dealing with a solution looking for a problem rather than a problem looking for a solution. This is blatant voter suppression. It is un-American, and it should be confronted by the leaders of both parties.
And that's what's remarkable to me is that you will occasionally hear people, if you get into arguments about this, and I don't think there are essentially any really good arguments on the other side supporting these rules. But one argument you'll hear is, look, we're just talking about a handful of people at the margins. This isn't going to be that big a deal. If you actually look at the voting population and the folks who don't have ID, there's not a big overlap. And what's interesting about that to me is if it's not that big a deal, why are you going through so much effort to push these laws in every single state that you have control of the legislature?
Because it is a big deal, and they know it's a big deal. Any number of studies show the number of people that would not be able to vote. When we look at the lines that we had to go through last year just to mobilize a vote, they know it's a big deal, and it's our right to vote. And let me quickly add, you hear a lot of them say, well, why shouldn't people have ID to vote? People do have ID to vote. Right. What is wrong with the ID we've always had? The ID when Jimmy Carter ran and Nixon ran and Bill Clinton ran. Now all of a sudden we get to President Obama, we all of a sudden need new ID when there's no new circumstance, no new evidence of fraud. It is blatant voter suppression, and we've got to deal with it as it is, just a nuanced way of trying to suppress votes.
That is the Reverend Al Sharpton. You're going to want to stick around tomorrow and see his special. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Joining me now from San Antonio, Texas, Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro and co-director of the civil rights organization, the Advancement Project, Judith Browne Dianis in Washington. Congressman, I want to ask you what today's intervention by the DOJ on behalf of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit over Texas's law, what that means for voters in Texas and you and the political future of folks like you.
Well, Chris, hopefully it means that Texans will be able to vote in the way that they've been used to voting for, many decades now. I was in the Texas legislature in 2011 and before that for several years and saw the Republican majority not only pass this voter ID law, but also make it harder to register to vote, to register others to vote, to do mail balloting. So it's been a series of hurdles that they've tried to put in the way to make it harder for Texans to vote, and these laws disproportionately affect low-income voters and minority voters. They know what they're doing. They're trying to shave off, if it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 points. We all know that people win a lot of elections in those small margins, and that's what they're trying to accomplish.
Judy, the lawsuits are being done under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, if I understand that correctly. If it was left standing by the Shelby County decision the court handed down earlier this year. What do you say to folks who say, hey, look, Voting Rights Act still in operation. Government could use Section 2. They're going to work it out in courts. There's no problem here.
Well, Chris, I mean, it's important that the Supreme Court took an axe to the Voting Rights Act. And actually, when they got rid of Section 4, which meant really Section 5, it means that we can't prevent discrimination before it happens. It was a really important tool. But that's not going to stop us. It's going to be a harder road for us to go through, but we're going to bring the litigation. The Department of Justice, thank goodness, Attorney General Holder is there at this moment because he was able to push their resources from their Section 5 preclearance part of their department over to Section 2. And clearly they're showing that they are aggressively going to protect voters. So we're glad that we have a friend at the Department of Justice.
Congressman, one of your colleagues I saw quoted today, a Republican colleague of yours, who asked the Department of Justice to stop these lawsuits until Congress could come up with a legislative solution, because, of course, the Supreme Court decision kicked it back to Congress to come up with a new framework for determining which jurisdictions should be subjected to preclearance. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that it's a cynical answer, because Republicans know right now that there is such gridlock in Congress because of the Tea Party control of the House of Representatives and how much John Boehner has to tend to them. So they know that if you send something back to Congress, nothing's going to get done.
Judy, I think it's really important for people to understand, I think, in the context of this discussion about voter suppression, that it isn't just African Americans necessarily who are either being targeted or hurt by these rules. We are seeing in states like in this case in Arizona, in which the issue on the and Kansas, the issue on the table is whether you are a legal immigrant or not, whether you're a legal citizen. What effects do those kinds of laws have? What do we know about the effects of those kinds of laws? And what does today's lawsuits by those two states mean?
Right. Clearly, what we know is that the GOP, in passing these laws and in trying to make the moves that they are trying to do in Arizona and in Kansas, is really also about Latino voters. I mean, they're going after everybody. Anybody who they think is not voting for them in record numbers, like they voted for President Obama in 2008 and 2012, all of those people, including young voters, like in North Carolina, going after college students. The GOP is after you. They want to silence people that didn't vote for them in the past. And so what we know is that, this fight is going, it's like, it's a battle among these states as to who can be the best at voter suppression. It's like, it's kind of like the, battle of the barbecue. Is Texas versus North Carolina. Now we have Arizona and Kansas entering into it, all about trying to rip off our democracy and silence people at a time when people are clearly at unrest, that they're upset about the way that this country is moving. And instead of getting people on issues, the GOP has decided to manipulate the way that we vote.
Congressman, do you hear, you're in August recess, you're back in your district at the moment. Do you hear people talk about this issue? Is this something that is a concern of constituents of yours? Are you hearing it when you do constituent events?
Certainly. No, people are absolutely concerned and very confused about whether they're going to need a photo ID, whether they're still going to be allowed to vote in the same way that they have before. Many of these folks are senior citizens, 70, 75 years old. And so there's a lot of confusion and a lot of concern out there. And I'm glad that the Justice Department is filing suit. It's sad, really, that it's come to this in Texas, but the Republican state leadership has really done this to themselves, and I'm hopeful that the DOJ will be successful in this effort.
Congressman Joaquin Castro and Judith Browne Dianis of the Advancement Project, thank you both.